The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the bare branches of the park's winter trees. On a moss-covered stone bench sat Mrs. Grace, an elderly black woman, wrapped in a light gray coat frayed at the cuffs but carefully pressed, as if holding on to a dignity the world often sought to erode. Her hands rested gently on her lap, calm and steady, while a faint glimmer of a silver hearing aid blinked quietly in her ear. Around her, the park was almost deserted. Only the dry rustle of fallen leaves and distant bird calls filled the air. She seemed invisible to the world, yet unyielding in her stillness. Suddenly, heavy, impatient footsteps shattered the quiet. Officer Mason appeared, tall, rigid in his uniform, chest gleaming with shiny buttons, his belt heavy with the tools of authority. His eyes scanned the empty park like a predator surveying his territory. Without greeting or question, he approached with a force that made the air itself tense. Then came the sharp, deliberate crack. The baton slammed against the edge of the bench just inches from Mrs. Grace's shoulder. The sound echoed, a harsh punctuation in the peaceful park, as if to remind everyone who held power here. Mason's voice followed, low and charged with command. "Who do you think you are? Sitting here like you own the whole damn block?" The words hung in the air, demanding a response. Yet Mrs. Grace said nothing. No fear flickered in her eyes. No tremble shook her hands. She met his glare with a steady, eerily calm gaze. A gaze forged by a lifetime of endurance, one that carried the weight of battles fought silently and scars unseen. Something in that silence unsettled Mason. He was used to compliance, to submission. He had barked orders at countless others who either cowered or argued. But here, before him, was a woman who refused to shrink, whose quiet strength cut deeper than any shouted insult. The weight of her stare pressed down on him, as if the roles had reversed. It was no longer the officer scrutinizing a suspect. It was a reckoning, a mirror held up to a man who had never been challenged this way. In that moment, the park seemed to hold its breath. The usual script of power and obedience was broken, and the question lingered: what happens when dignity refuses to be erased? Mason's fury burned beneath the surface, but Mrs. Grace remained unmoved. And with that, the true battle had only just begun. Officer Mason had long been accustomed to wielding his authority with an iron fist. The city streets had shaped him into a man who expected obedience, who thrived on the quick submission of those he deemed lesser. He was no stranger to confrontations. Heated words, fists raised, orders barked into the faces of those who dared resist. But none of that prepared him for what he faced now. Mrs. Grace did not flinch. Her calm was a provocation far greater than any shouted insult or physical shove. She sat poised, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes steady and unyielding. Mason's breath hitched for a fraction of a second, a sensation he neither expected nor understood. The power he thought so solid beneath his feet suddenly felt uncertain. Then, with an abrupt motion, Mason's baton slammed down again, this time not against the bench, but against the ground, dislodging the small burlap bag resting quietly at Mrs. Grace's side. The bag tumbled, spilling its contents onto the cold stone. A worn book, a folded black and white photograph, a small bottle of medication, and a few coins scattered like forgotten memories. The sound of the items clattering was a jarring contrast to the stillness Mrs. Grace embodied. Mason's voice cut through the silence with sharp impatience. "Pick that up. Now." Without hesitation, without haste, Mrs. Grace bent slowly. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the cold that bit into her bones like the years she had endured. She lifted each item carefully, as though retrieving fragments of a story too precious to lose. The book, its cover creased and softened by time. The photograph, edges worn but the faces forever clear. The small glass bottle, containing medicine no longer within reach of many. Each piece was a testament to a life lived with resilience. Mason's eyes narrowed. He expected submission. He expected tears, apologies, even resistance, but certainly not this quiet dignity that refused to crumble under pressure. He stepped closer, the proximity meant to intimidate, to remind her who held the power. "You're coming with me," he said, voice low and commanding. Mrs. Grace rose slowly, never averting her gaze. No anger flared in her eyes, no pleading, no despair, just an unshakable presence that seemed to fill the entire park. She stood tall, framed by the bare branches and the fading light, a figure carved in quiet strength. Mason felt the world shift beneath him. He motioned sharply, signaling for her to move. His hand jerked in emotion as if pulling a reluctant animal back to its cage. But she did not move immediately. For a moment, their eyes locked. His filled with frustration and something like fear, hers steady, almost mournful, as if silently asking how far this confrontation must go before justice is recognized. The tension between them crackled in the cold air. Nearby, a lone figure on a distant path paused, drawn by the scene unfolding. No one else was around to witness, but somehow the moment felt weighty, as though history itself held its breath. Mason's jaw tightened. He was no longer the man in control. The badge on his chest felt heavier, the baton in his hand less like a tool and more like a weapon pointed inward. He took a step forward. "Move," he repeated. Mrs. Grace took one deliberate step back, placing the scattered items back into her bag with a care that defied the chaos Mason had tried to impose. "You don't understand," Mason hissed, the edge in his voice betraying his unease. "You're under arrest. Resist, and things will get worse for you." She shook her head slowly, the faintest trace of sorrow in her eyes. "I'm not resisting," she said softly, her voice steady, yet carrying a depth that cut through the cold. "I'm standing." It was a simple sentence, yet it landed like a thunderclap. Mason blinked, his mind racing. The weight of her words wasn't in their volume, but in their conviction. The quiet defiance was more threatening than any scream, more potent than any physical threat. It was a challenge to the system, to the assumptions he had built his authority upon. The baton felt heavier in his grip. The coldness in his chest grew, a tight knot of doubt twisting painfully as he glanced around, the empty park now seeming suffocatingly small. The fading light cast long shadows, shadows that stretched beyond the physical space, into the crevices of his conscience. Mrs. Grace, steady as ever, took a breath. "You don't have to do this," she said. "But if you do know this, I will not be broken." Mason's hand trembled slightly. It was a weakness he was desperate to conceal. His voice dropped, edged with frustration. "You think this is a choice? You think you have power here?" She smiled faintly, not mockingly, but with the kind of grace earned only through hardship. "Power is not given," she said. "It is held in the heart, even when the world tries to take it away." The silence that followed was heavy, dense with unspoken truths. Mason swallowed hard, the weight of years of hardened belief pressing down on him. He was the law. He was supposed to be the enforcer. But here, in front of a woman whose calmness rivaled storms, he was forced to reckon with a reality he had long ignored. His eyes flickered, searching hers for any sign of weakness. There was none. For the first time, Mason felt small. Not in stature, but in spirit. He barked an order, voice cracking. "Get in the car." Mrs. Grace moved, not out of fear, but with quiet resolve. Each step was deliberate, a testament to a lifetime of standing tall against forces that sought to diminish her. As they walked away from the bench, the park seemed to exhale, releasing a breath it had been holding. The stillness returned, but the air remained charged, as if the encounter had shifted something fundamental. Mason looked over his shoulder, haunted by the unwavering gaze of a woman who refused to be silenced. And deep inside, beneath layers of anger and authority, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred. A question, a crack in the armor. The confrontation was far from over. The tension that had hung in the park did not dissipate with Mrs. Grace's quiet compliance. Instead, it rippled outward, reaching ears and eyes far beyond the empty benches and rustling leaves. It was then, at the edge of the scene, that Mr. Howard appeared. He was not a man of loud proclamations or grand gestures. No sharp suit, no flashing badge. Just a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the air the moment he stepped beside Mrs. Grace. The mere presence of this lawyer, steady and unyielding, was enough to shift the weight of the moment. Neither words nor weapons were needed. Respect and awe followed him like a silent entourage. Howard did not speak. He simply stood there, a guardian shadow beside the elderly woman whose strength had already begun to unnerve Officer Mason. Together, they became an unspoken statement, a challenge to the power that had so long gone unchecked. Unbeknownst to them, a phone from a hidden vantage had begun to record. The harsh words, the batten's crack against wood, Mrs. Grace's dignified silence, and Howard's calm assurance, all captured in grainy pixels. The clip was shared, then reshared, spreading like wildfire through social media and news outlets alike. The city watched, riveted and outraged. What unfolded next was more than just a viral sensation. It was a collective awakening. Communities, long silenced by fear and indifference, found a voice in the image of Mrs. Grace and the steady presence of Mr. Howard. Their story became a rallying cry, not for chaos, but for justice. Not for division, but for reckoning. Questions poured in. How had it come to this? How could a man entrusted with law enforcement wield such disregard for humanity? Public outrage mounted with each passing hour. Editorials debated, activists marched, and officials scrambled to respond. Officer Mason, once a figure of unquestioned authority, now stood isolated, his actions under fierce scrutiny. But amidst the noise and fervor, Mrs. Grace did something unexpected. She declined every offer of praise, every invitation to be a symbol or a figurehead. No medals, no speeches, no public appearances. She chose instead to speak through a letter, simple, profound, and searingly honest. The letter circulated quietly at first, slipped into the hands of officials, read aloud in community meetings, and then published in newspapers and online platforms. It was a mirror held up to society and to the police system itself. In it, Mrs. Grace wrote not of anger or vengeance, but of a hope that had been nearly extinguished, the hope that those sworn to protect would begin to truly see, hear, and honor the dignity of every person. She spoke of the wounds inflicted not just by the baton or the words, but by the silence and complicity that allowed such moments to persist. Her words cut deeper than any shouted protest, forcing uncomfortable reflection in hearts and halls of power. The system that had once seemed impenetrable began to crack, revealing its flaws not as isolated incidents, but as symptoms of a broader sickness. Within police precincts, murmurs turned to conversations. Some officers looked at the letter with shame, recalling moments they had chosen indifference over courage. Others clung to denial, defensive and angry, unwilling to face the shifting tide. But even the most resistant could not ignore the growing demand for change. In city halls and legislative chambers, debates erupted about policies, accountability, and training. Promises of reform were made, some sincere, others perfunctory. Yet beneath the surface, a deeper transformation was underway, one that no politician could control. For Mrs. Grace, the awakening was not about her alone. It was about every person who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or diminished. The letter was her legacy, not a cry for recognition, but a call to conscience. Days turned to weeks, and the viral clip that had sparked outrage became a symbol of resistance. Not because of violence or rhetoric, but because of a quiet refusal to be broken. Communities organized, demanding not only justice for Mrs. Grace but systemic change to prevent future abuses. Officer Mason found himself a pariah. Invitations to speak or teach on ethics evaporated. Colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with the stain on their profession. Social media buzzed with comments, many unforgiving, some reflective. The man who once projected power now grappled with isolation. Yet through it all, Mrs. Grace remained distant from the spotlight. She returned to her quiet life, her strength no less profound for being unseen by the masses. In moments of solitude, she held the letter close, a reminder of the power in steadfast dignity. The letter's influence reached beyond the city. Other communities began examining their own systems, inspired by the courage of one woman and the unwavering support of a single lawyer. Conversations about policing, justice, and respect for humanity gained new urgency at tea times. The awakening felt fragile, a flame flickering in a harsh wind. Yet with each story told, each voice raised, the flame grew stronger, fueled by truth and the refusal to accept the status quo. The system, once deaf to cries for change, now faced a reckoning. Not through force or fury, but through the persistent, patient demand for justice embodied by Mrs. Grace and those who stood with her, and in the quiet spaces between headlines and protests, a new understanding took root. That power wielded without humanity is hollow. That true strength lies in respect and dignity, and that the awakening of a system begins when the silenced find their voice, and those in power finally listen. Mrs. Grace's story did not end in the courtroom or on the evening news. It transcended the headlines and became a living legacy, etched into the hearts and minds of generations. Children, wide-eyed and curious, began to call her grandma, a term loaded with affection, respect, and a deep understanding of the battles she silently fought and won. To them, she was more than an elderly woman from a quiet neighborhood park. She was a beacon of resilience, a symbol of justice standing firm against a tide of oppression. In schools, in living rooms, and on playgrounds, stories of Mrs. Grace's quiet strength were shared with reverence. Teachers used her example to teach lessons beyond textbooks, lessons of courage, dignity, and the power of peaceful resistance. A little girl with curly hair, holding a crayon drawing of Mrs. Grace standing tall between shadows of injustice, captured the imagination of her entire class. "If I grow up like her," the girl whispered one day, "my mom won't be scared anymore." And in that simple sentence lay a profound truth, the impact of one life rippling outward, quiet but unstoppable. Meanwhile, Officer Mason's world unraveled in stark contrast. The man who once embodied authority and control was stripped of his certification, dismissed from his post, and forever barred from serving in law enforcement. His actions, once justified by protocol and authority, were now laid bare as the tragic consequences of lost humanity. Every case he had touched came under new scrutiny. Investigations reopened. Victims were invited to recount their stories, to seek justice that had long been denied. But what was most striking was not just the legal reckoning, it was the societal one. A silent but powerful boycott took hold. No grand protests or violent uprisings marked the rejection of injustice. Rather, it was an unyielding, collective turning away. Shops refused to display his books. Community centers removed his name from plaques. Social media feeds filled with subtle, yet poignant reminders. Remember who walked these halls before you. The boycott was less about punishment and more about remembrance. A quiet vow never to forget the cost of complacency. The ripple effect extended beyond Mason's immediate sphere. Other officers, some complicit and others simply silent, felt the pressure of a shifting tide. Some resigned quietly, unwilling to face the gaze of a community awakening to truth. Others found themselves confronted by old colleagues, family, even their own conscience, forcing introspection that had been long avoided. It was no longer possible to hide behind uniforms or bureaucratic defenses. Society's eyes were open, watching, demanding accountability. Communities began organizing in new ways, Groups once divided by geography or background found common ground in shared outrage and hope. Workshops on civil rights filled halls. Conversations about police reform moved from whispered fears to determined action plans. Mrs. Grace's name became a rallying point, not for anger, but for progress. She was a reminder that change begins with courage, and that resilience can rewrite history. And yet, through it all, Mrs. Grace remained remarkably absent from the limelight. She did not seek awards, nor did she chase recognition. Her legacy was carried forward by others, by children who drew her likeness, by activists who channeled her spirit, by ordinary citizens who dared to question the status quo. Her letter, once a quiet call to conscience, was now a manifesto for justice, read in city councils and echoed in community centers. It demanded not only reform but transformation, a reimagining of a system built on respect and dignity rather than fear and control. The boycott extended into every facet of public life. Educational institutions reevaluated curricula to include lessons on systemic injustice and the power of peaceful resistance. Local businesses pledged support for community programs focused on healing and empowerment. Even places that once had no voice, the silent streets, the forgotten neighborhoods, began to pulse with life and activism. The weight of change was tangible. It was seen in the bowed heads of those once blind to injustice, in the quiet apologies whispered behind closed doors, and in the relentless pursuit of truth by those who refused to accept easy answers. The story of Mrs. Grace had become more than an incident. It was a catalyst for awakening, yet, despite the widespread movement, the journey was far from over. The boycott was not a moment but a movement, a sustained commitment to justice that required vigilance, empathy, and unrelenting courage. Every new case of abuse, every whispered story of discrimination, was met with renewed determination fueled by the legacy of a woman who refused to be broken in quiet moments. When the world seemed too heavy with anger and grief, Mrs. Grace's story served as a balm. It reminded people that change did not need to roar. It could whisper, persist, and endure. That even in the face of overwhelming odds, dignity and strength could carve a path toward hope. The true power of Mrs. Grace's legacy was not measured in headlines or hashtags, but in the lives it touched. The children who grew up knowing their worth, the communities that demanded better, and the society that slowly but surely began to reject injustice not with fury, but with unshakable resolve as the years passed. The shadow of Officer Mason faded, replaced by the light cast by Mrs. Grace and those who followed in her footsteps. The boycott, the renewed calls for justice, and the deep societal reflection became chapters in a larger story. A story of resilience, transformation, and the enduring belief that one person's courage can inspire a nation to rise. And so, in every whispered grandma uttered by a child, in every quiet act of defiance against injustice, Mrs. Grace lived on, an everlasting symbol of hope, a reminder that humanity, when faced with cruelty, can choose to stand tall, speak truth, and demand change in a world often marked by loud voices and violent upheavals. Sometimes the most powerful statements are made in silence. Mrs. Grace, without raising her voice or brandishing weapons, became a living symbol, a mirror held up not only to Officer Mason but to an entire society. Through her calm resilience, she forced everyone to confront their own reflections, their histories, and the uncomfortable truths long ignored. Her story transcended the boundaries of one encounter. It was no longer about a single moment of injustice, but a systemic awakening to justice, human rights, and the profound power of dignity. When Mrs. Grace sat quietly on that park bench, when she refused to be broken by the harsh words and blows aimed at her, she embodied something timeless and universal. The strength that lies within every human being to stand firm against oppression. This mirror she held up was not just for those who wielded power carelessly. It was for all of us. It called on us to look inward, to examine the legacies we carry, the biases we harbor, and the courage we are willing to summon. It reminded us that change is not only possible but necessary, that justice demands participation from everyone, not just the few. Mrs. Grace's encounter with Officer Mason was a microcosm of the larger struggles we face as a society. It illuminated the cracks in the systems that were supposed to protect and serve but sometimes faltered under the weight of prejudice and complacency. Her presence challenged those systems to do better, to be better. From a personal perspective, her story teaches us invaluable lessons about resilience, compassion, and the power of peaceful resistance. It reminds us that standing up for what is right does not always require shouting or confrontation. Sometimes it requires unwavering calm, a steady gaze, and a refusal to be diminished. In an age where outrage can be both overwhelming and fleeting, Mrs. Grace's quiet dignity offers a blueprint for lasting impact. Her legacy invites us to reflect on our own actions. How do we respond when faced with injustice? Do we speak up or turn away? Do we perpetuate silence, or do we become part of the awakening? These questions are as relevant today as ever. As we absorb the lessons from Mrs. Grace's story, it becomes clear that the path to justice is paved not only with protests and laws but with everyday choices to listen, to empathize, and to act. It is a call for each of us to become mirrors in our own right, reflecting truth and compassion in our communities. For educators, activists, and everyday citizens alike, her example is a powerful reminder that change often begins quietly, in moments that may seem small but carry the weight of generations. By embracing this perspective, we can foster a culture that values dignity, accountability, and human rights. If Mrs. Grace's story has touched you, inspired you, or made you think deeply, we invite you to join this journey of awareness and transformation. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that illuminate the human spirit, challenge injustices, and celebrate the courage within us all. Together, we can create a space where voices, quiet or loud, are heard and valued, where history is acknowledged, lessons are learned, and futures are forged with empathy and resolve. Mrs. Grace's mirror is held out for all of us. Will you look? Thank you for being part of this community. Your awareness, your voice, and your commitment are vital. Stay inspired, stay engaged, and remember, sometimes the strongest revolution is the one that happens within.